Hello, this is Gradye Parsons, and today we're going to have a special treat. We're going to have an interview with Gil Rendle, a Methodist minister, consultant, author, especially of the most recent book, Journey in the Wilderness. Hello, Gil. Welcome to our conversation together.
Thank you.
You do a lot of work around the church and looking at the statistics in the church and studying what's happening out in the church. What do you see to be some of the major changes that are going on out in the church?
Well, part of the major changes going around the church are really just a very different culture that we have to live into. The culture that we have been most effective in, it no longer really is present for our congregations. And so we're driven by a culture now that has really deep generational differences, that has much stronger economic differences, that is very preferential. It's much more individually oriented toward a person's understanding of themselves as opposed to how do they become part of a group and form their identity in that way. And so our congregations have to learn how to do formation in a very different way. They have to learn how to relate to their communities in a very different way. One of the things that I often point to is that we started out doing Christian education, which is what you do with groups of people. And now we're trying to learn how to do Christian formation, which is what you do with individuals. And so that's a huge shift for us. It takes us out of our former practices and we have to rethink again. And that for me would be just an example of how deep the change is, that we have to rethink everything because of the change around us.
Well, as part of that rethinking, what are some of the questions you think the church should be asking itself or wrestling with during this time?
The way that I've approached that is through some work that Alice Mann and I did when I was on staff with Alban Institute, and we would talk about holy conversations. The idea that our congregations and our leaders in our congregations really have to start conversations about much more important things rather than talk about their facilities and their programs and their budgets and their membership. And the three generic questions that it comes down to is, who are we, what does God ask us to do now, and who is our neighbor, where are we located right now? And they feel like amazingly simple questions, but they're actually quite difficult. And the reason they're difficult is because in an established congregation, we think we already know. You ask a congregation, who are you, and they'll tell you just like that. But for the most part, what they're telling you is the way they think about themselves, which is related to the way they were in the past. One of the questions I ask a lot of groups that I work with is how many people think of themselves as younger than they actually are, and everybody raises their hand. And then I point out, well, that means you know more about who you were than about who you are, because that's how you think about yourself. Well, our congregations know much more about who they were than about who they are and what God's asking them to do right now. So if we can get into conversations about identity, who are we now, and purpose, what does God ask us to do, and if we can relate that to the mission field, where are we located, who is our neighbor right now, those are the kinds of things that if our congregations can walk deeply into those conversations and not settle too quickly for answers, easy answers, and not settle too quickly on programs, it has a real potential to invite us into discernment, to rethink again, what is this relationship with Christ that we're invited into.
You've also talked some about the changing role of clergy, how the clergy role has changed in the current paradigm from where it was before. Could you say some more about that?
Well, that goes in so many different areas. The dominant way in which clergy, I think, have been trained, and the older expectation of an earlier generation, was that the clergy was the manager of the congregational system and had primary responsibility to make sure that everybody was satisfied with what was going on. And so a tremendous amount of energy and effort was given toward managing relationships and making sure everything was in place and orderly and so forth. And as much as that still has to happen, I mean, there's a certain amount of that you just can't lose, because we are communities that are built on relationship and so forth. We're now at a point where clergy have to be much clearer about how do you help a person form their life. And the clergy have to be prepared to kind of stand with people while they're asking life questions.
Mm-hmm.
I was trained to stand with people during life questions to provide a function.
Mm.
You know, can I do a baptism? Can I do a wedding or a
Right.
funeral? Or do I know how to be empathetic? Today it's requiring a lot more than that. How do you stand with people and help them out of the disciplines of the church and out of the learnings of the church and out of an encounter with Christ to bring meaning to the experience they're having? It isn't just being empathetic in a time of suffering, it's to help people wrestle with how is this suffering reforming you? And what, you know, what would that mean for you, you know, to hold the suffering rather than try to escape it. So what clergy are being asked for, what leaders of congregation, I don't think it's just clergy. I think, you know, laity have a much larger role in this now than ever. We're being asked for a much deeper role of leadership than we ever have been in my time before.
You've read the Mid-Council Commission's report. And
Some of it,
and you said some positive words to me about the different experiments that were going on.
Yeah. And this relates to my work on change with denominations, that people, they realize that what we're doing no longer is sustainable. And so we are trying to very quickly, you know, learn and establish what will work better. But for the most part, we're rushing too quickly to try to consolidate things, to try to solidify them, to try to say this is how it now must be. And in fact, the way we're going to work our way through this is by experiments. One of my favorite sayings that I've been told is a North American saying is that stumbling is moving ahead faster. And so the way we're going to get to this new form of how we will be with one another is by stumbling through all these experiments. Well, the Mid-Council Commission, who I believe was asked to come up with a model for a presbytery, quickly learned, I think wisely, that there is not a model that you can kind of install across a large system. But they then began to talk about the multitude of experiments that are going on, and they begin to name all the presbyteries. And one of the things I suggested in our conversation was it's good to recognize the importance of experiments, but it was also really valuable that they put the names of the presbyteries in there that are experimenting. Because the way we learn is by talking to each other about what we're doing. And that helps us to discover, you know, how it needs to go from there.
In your travels around the church and all kinds of congregations of all different types of faiths, what is one hopeful thing you're seeing out there?
There are multitudes of hopeful things that I encounter. I think that there's two places I would point. One is people getting more passionate. It isn't that they've necessarily found the thing, but they're getting passionate about the pursuit of this relationship with Christ, about this pursuit of purpose. And if there's any other thing that I am, you know, immeasurably in hope because of, it is the courage that people are showing. In a really deeply established organization or institution like a church or a denomination, those practices are so deeply embedded, those norms are so deeply embedded, that to challenge them takes a tremendous amount of courage. Somebody has to stand up and say, you know, the king has no clothes. Somebody has to stand up and say, this is not sustainable, it's not working, we have to do something different. Because we are highly relational, to take that position risks relationships. Well, it takes a lot of courage. And increasingly, we're finding a growing cohort of people who have that courage. In my system, we've got a growing number of bishops who are talking to each other to be able to take that kind of a position. I'm seeing groups of clergy now doing that. There's been a couple of situations where the initiative comes from a group of lay people who are no longer willing to accept what they've been hearing from their denomination or from their clergy. We're simply saying, no, we're going to stand and we're going to address this question from a different perspective. Nobody's got the answer, but boy, that's a good conversation.
It sure is. Well, I want to thank you for your courage and continue to press us with questions that make us think things different ways and makes us challenge our own norms. And thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you. Pleasure.